Hi, welcome back to episode 18. For those of you who are here for the first time, a huge big welcome. I'm Dr. Catherine Hughes. We all know who Ted Bundy is. We've all seen the photos of this handsome, charming man, and you would never expect someone who seems so respectable to commit crimes like this. I certainly know that if I met him, I'd have gone on a date with him and I'd probably be dead. He has the kind of smile and demeanour that might make you trust him. Even knowing all of the horrific crimes that he's committed, it's hard to match the man to the crimes in your mind. So let's crack on and learn all about old Teddy. It's going to get weird, graphic and messy. Today's podcast, in all seriousness, contains very disturbing details of voyeurism, rape, torture, murder and necrophilia. There's a lot of information available on Ted Bundy, including a documentary which contains extracts from taped interviews that he gave while he was on death row. These give us some insight into Bundy's dark mind. Often, when you closely examine a person's life before they killed, there are often cues to understanding why they killed. Ted Bundy's birth name was Theodore Robert Cowell. He changed his name later in life to that of his stepfather. He was born in 1946 to Louise. Ted was brought up to believe that actually his grandparents were his mother and father. The truth was that his mother was an unmarried mother and his father's identity was never determined with any certainty. In an effort to avoid the stigma and embarrassment, his grandparents said that they were his mother and father and that his mother was actually his sister. All of their friends and family were told that his grandparents were his parents. Ted did find out later that that wasn't the case. He's since said that he had a lifelong resentment towards his mother for never talking to him about his real father and for leaving him to discover the true parentage for himself. During interviews, Bundy spoke very lovingly about his grandparents. To the outside world, they seemed to be a very happy, loving and supportive family. Bundy said that he respected his grandfather and identified with him. However, he later revealed to an attorney that his grandfather was a bully and a bigot. He hated black people, Catholics, Italians and Jews. His grandfather would beat up his wife, who was a very timid woman. He'd also beat up the family dog and swing the cats around by their tail. He was even violent towards his own children. One of the daughters was once thrown down the stairs for sleeping in. It is possible that the grandfather had mental health issues because he would sometimes talk out loud to an unseen entity and would have fits of rage. But despite that, Bundy and others spoke of a warm, loving upbringing which was fairly standard. Louise left home to live with cousins and took her son to live with her. She then met John Bundy and they married and had 4 children. Although Johnny tried to include his adoptive son in all of the family activities, Ted remained distant. Bundy later complained to his girlfriend that Johnny wasn't his real father. He told her that he wasn't very bright and didn't make much money. This is the very beginning of his tendency to view everyone as being beneath him in some way. He saw himself as something better than those around him. We see more of this later in his life too. Bundy was a chronic liar and he told different stories to different people. In one instance, he spoke of when he was growing up. He described how he roamed the streets within his neighbourhood, picking through bins and in search of pictures of naked women. However, he spoke to another person and explained how he looked at detective magazines, crime novels and true crime documentaries for stories that involved sexual violence, particularly when the stories were illustrated with pictures or had pictures of dead or maimed bodies in them. However, in a letter that he wrote, he said that he has in fact never read fact detective magazines and shuddered at the thought that anyone would. He provides different accounts of his life depending on who he's speaking to. This showed the level of manipulation that he was capable of. He'd managed to tailor himself and what he was saying to the listener. In his conversations with two authors, he described how he'd consumed large quantities of alcohol and, as he put it, canvassed the community late at night in search of undraped windows where he could observe women undressing or whatever else could be seen. Bundy also varied the accounts of his social life. He told two interviews that he chose to be alone as an adolescent because he was unable to understand the interpersonal relationships. He claimed that he had no natural sense of how to develop friendships. He's quoted as saying, "I didn't know what made people want to be friends," he said. "I didn't know what underlying social interactions were." Classmates from his high school, however, said that Bundy was well known and well liked there, and that Bundy was a medium-sized fish in a large pond. It's clear then that Bundy's experience and outlook on the world was very different from how others seen it. When Ted Bundy describes his childhood, he talks a lot of the children that came to play with him in the area. He said that he was skilled at looking like he fitted in, when in fact he didn't know how to develop close personal interactions. This inability to be able to relate to others or understand them socially or emotionally only grew as he got older. This was the main element to his psychopathy when he went on to kill people. Psychopaths just can't empathise with others. They just aren't able to put themselves in somebody else's position or understand how they feel. As I've said on a number of occasions in the past, when somebody commits a murder, it's never going to be their first crime. Whether or not the authorities know of the crime is a different matter. During high school, Bundy was arrested at least twice on suspicion of burglary and auto theft. Bundy grew up to be a charming, handsome young man. He was very friendly and approachable, and people who met him trusted him. He went on to become a law school student, which resulted in him moving. He believed that he was very intelligent. However, his class friends would say that he sometimes struggled to keep up. He had ideas of grandiose about himself. He consistently saw other people as being beneath him in some way and often showed them contempt. Several young girls were missing and then murdered. Bundy had managed to evade capture by giving some very serious thought to how the police operated. He would make sure, for example, that he left no evidence at the crime scenes so that none of them could be linked to him. He also consciously moved around states to murder because he knew how difficult it would be for the police to know what had previously occurred. At that time, there were no central databases, no computers, no fax machines. All communications between different police forces were done via written post. During the time that he was murdering, he continued to live an outwardly normal life. He worked on a political campaign. He had relationships and was liked by everyone who he met. He developed this skill of being able to mask his inner darkness. He'd learned how to appear to relate to others. Bundy had changed his demeanour easily and be manipulative with some people, and he would manipulate them into believing whatever he wanted them to believe. He developed this skill of being able to charm people into doing what he wanted. Many of Bundy's young female victims regarded him as handsome, charismatic, and these were traits that he exploited to win their trust. He typically approached them in public places, feigning an injury or a disability, or impersonating an authority figure. And then he would overpower them and assault them in secluded locations. We now know that he sometimes went back to the crime scenes, grooming them and performing sexual acts with the decomposing corpses until it was no longer possible to do so because of decomposition. He decapitated at least 12 of his victims, and he kept some of the severed heads as mementos in his apartment. On a few occasions, he broke into dwellings at night and bludgeoned his victims as they slept. He told his girlfriend that he would follow sorority girls on campus and that he tried not to but was unable to stop. He eventually told her that he was sick. It was this girlfriend that rang the police to report that although she didn't know of any crime, she thought the police should take a closer look at him. After girls had gone missing in several states, a new string of attacks began. He raped and strangled an unidentified hitchhiker in Idaho, then either disposed of the remains immediately in a nearby river or he returned the next day to photograph and dismember the corpse. Shortly after that, a 16-year-old female was attacked and he dragged her into a wooded area and was raped and strangled. Bundy was a thrill seeker and he experimented with various ways of tricking his victims into helping him, peeping on others, following girls and then raping, and eventually, of course, onto killing them. Even then, he still went further with his activities and went back to the crime scenes and interfered with their bodies. On October the 18th, a 17-year-old girl went missing. A nude body was found in a nearby mountainous area 9 days later. A post-mortem examination indicated that she might have actually remained alive for up to 7 days following her disappearance. On October the 31st, another 17-year-old female disappeared 25 miles south of that after leaving a cafe just after midnight. A naked body was found by hikers 9 miles to the northeast of the American Fork Canyon on Thanksgiving Day. Both of these women had been beaten, raped, sodomized and strangled with nylon stockings. Years later, Bundy described his post-mortem rituals with the corpses of Smith and Amy, including hair shampooing and the application of makeup. These crimes clearly had a sexual element to them. As with most serial killers, there is always an escalation in the level of violence that's used. For Bundy, it was no longer enough to just rape. He wanted to rape and then kill. When that was no longer enough, he began to mutilate the bodies of these women, and that progressed onto performing acts with the bodies once they were dead. He denied the murders at first, but was convicted of them. During earlier interviews with a journalist, Bundy, speaking about the murder, had said, "A person of this type chooses his victims for a reason. His victims are all young, attractive women. Women are possessions, beings which are subservient, more often than not, to males. Women are merchandise." He then went on to say there's no denying the sexual component. However, sex has significance only in the broader context of a much broader scheme of things. That is possession, control, violence. He went on to say, now let's consider the possibility that this person suffered from some sort of acute onset of a desire that resulted in killing young women. How do you account for that? He spoke about the individual, in inverted commas, and spoke about himself in the third person when discussing these crimes. He spoke of an entity which grew and grew. He did whatever the entity told him to do. He claimed the early manifestations of this condition, which is an interest concerning sexual images. Your standard fare that you would see in the movie house or in Playboy magazines. The interest becomes more skewed towards a more specialised literature. Some is pretty grotesque, which would preoccupy him more and more. It would reach a point where anger, the frustration, the anxiety, the poor self-image, feeling cheated, wronged, insecure, he decides upon young attractive women being his victims. Bundy continued to kill and was even arrested at several points. He engineered several breakouts from jail as well. He treated the courts and the police with a great deal of contempt, and he even represented himself in his trial. He believed that he was far superior to everyone that he was unfortunate enough to have to deal with. During the questioning of one suspect in his trial, he proceeded to ask the witness details of what he found at one of the crime scenes. A typical trait of serial killers is that they keep mementos or pictures so that they're able to relive the thrill of the murder. So by questioning that witness over and over, it's likely that Bundy found pleasure in receiving the details of the crime scene. Bundy treated the trial as a show, even proposing to his girlfriend during the questioning. The pair managed to have sex during his visits, and she went on to have a daughter. He feels no guilt because he can't. He just doesn't have that ability to. The girlfriend had stayed with him because she believed that he was innocent. She probably believed that the violent acts that she was hearing about in court couldn't have been carried out by this kind, loving man that she loved. It isn't a reflection on her at all. Bundy had spent years crafting this skill of being able to behave differently and in ways that people found likeable and admirable. Bundy denied the claims right up until his execution was ordered. Even after admitting to his crimes, he was in the enviable position of feeling no guilt at all. He was extremely narcissistic and he enjoyed all of the attention of the media. By admitting the crimes when he did, meant that he was able to delay his execution and remain in the spotlight for a little bit longer. Another added bonus of that would have been that he knew that he had something that others wanted. He had insight. Bundy was part of the in-depth interviews that the FBI carried out to build up a picture of violent criminals. He spent time with the FBI going through cases, suggesting what other offenders are likely to be thinking and what they did next. Dr. Dorothy Lewis was an expert who looked at the brain chemistry of violent men. She said that Bundy was a manic depressive and had bipolar disorder. His lawyers tried to argue that he wasn't competent to stand trial when he did, but I'm sure you can imagine the public pressure was immense. Bundy confessed to the murders in the last 3 days of his life. Bundy was finally executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison on January the 24th, 1989. The biographer, Anne Rule, described Bundy as a sadistic sociopath who took pleasure from another human's pain and the control that he had over his victims to the point of death and even after. He once described himself as the most cold-hearted son of a bitch you'll ever meet. So, in conclusion then, it's clear that Ted Bundy was suffering some kind of a mental health condition. He'd been described as a narcissist, a sociopath and a psychopath. He had difficulty relating to other people because he was unable to feel love or guilt. And that led to a horrific series of sexually sadistic murders which continued over some years. I believe that had he not been executed when he did, he would have been incapable of rehabilitation. I do hope that you found today's podcast interesting and I hope that you learned something new from it. I've now set up my Patreon account up with various member benefits and I would appreciate so much any support that you could give, and that helps me to allow you to bring you the content that you love so much. Thanks for listening then. Bye for now.